Hi, welcome back. So now we're going to pick up with letter B in your lecture notes, number 5, hematocrit. In the previous video, we talked about how red blood cells circulate throughout the body and are consistently picking fresh oxygen up at the level of the lungs. That oxygen diffuses across the walls of the lungs, specifically the alveoli, into the blood vessel and binds with the hemoglobin present inside of the red blood cell. That freshly oxygenated blood is then transported throughout the body to the various body tissues that are in need of oxygen for aerobic metabolism. That oxygen is then unloaded at the level of the body tissue by breaking the chemical bond with hemoglobin and diffusing out of the blood and into the body tissue, where it is then used by the cellular tissue in order to create fuel or ATP. That deoxygenated blood then travels back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen and the cycle starts again. So that really clarified that the role of the red blood cell is to transport oxygen around the body, okay? So the number or percentage of red blood cells directly affects or directly reflects the body's ability to carry oxygen. We sometimes refer to this as the oxygen carrying capacity, all right? So the more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen you are capable of transporting throughout the blood because you have more hemoglobin that can bind to more oxygen as it enters into the body. Now, the lower the number of red blood cells in your body, the less capacity your red blood cells have to bind oxygen because there's less hemoglobin in your body, right? So whenever referring to how many red blood cells are in the whole blood or the total percentage, this term is called hematocrit, okay? So hematocrit is the percentage of red blood cells in whole blood, okay? So a normal hematocrit for both males and females is somewhere in the range of 44 to 45%, okay? That means out of the entire 100% of whole blood, about 44 to 45% of that is made up of erythrocytes or red blood cells. Let me just change the color of my pen here. Great, okay. So, sorry, going back to this, we can tell what the components of our blood are by taking out a blood sample, spinning it down. This is part of a routine blood test that you may get at the doctor's office. For those of you who have already completed the blood case study, kind of got an insight into the different types of tests that can be run and the results that can be found on what's called a CBC, which is a complete blood count. That involves taking blood out of the body, putting it into a tube, spinning it around in a centrifuge, and breaking up the blood into its component parts. All right, so we have about 55% of the whole blood is the liquid medium, the plasma. Less than 1% of the blood is made up of white blood cells and platelets, and then the remaining is the red blood cells, the erythrocytes, okay? So your normal hematocrit, or percentage of red blood cells, is anywhere between 44 to 45%. All right. And this is dependent on whether you're a male or a female. Females tend to have a little bit less hematocrit, or a lower hematocrit number as normal compared to a male. And that simply has to do with males tend to carry a higher volume of blood than women do. However, women's blood can be much more flexible because of their ability to undergo pregnancy, also their monthly menstruation. So women are constantly making more blood to supply the needs of their body for reproductive purposes, okay? So keep that in mind, that your normal your normal percentage of red blood cells, or your normal hematocrit, is about 44 to 45. Okay, so what happens when that goes up or down, okay, outside of the normal range? When you have a hematocrit that is less than 44%, okay, you develop a condition called anemia. Okay, so anemia is when your red blood cell count falls below 44%. Okay, so what does this mean on a larger scale? That means that you have a less of ability to bind oxygen. So you have less O2 binding capacity. Okay, and this is because you have less red blood cells and therefore less hemoglobin to bind. Okay. The reason why your hematocrit may drop down and you develop anemia, which you can see right in the middle here, there's a direct picture of what a lower percentage of red blood cells would look like. Anemia can develop for a number of reasons, okay? It could be an interference with the production of red blood cells. For example, iron deficiency anemia. Iron is something that we already talked about as being vital for the creation of hemoglobin, right? It's the iron that physically binds to the oxygen within that hemoglobin molecule. So if you aren't getting enough iron in your diet, or your body's incapable of taking the iron from your diet and integrating it into the production of hemoglobin, right? You're going to basically make a red blood cell that isn't able to bind oxygen, and the creation of the red blood cells start to drop. So that would be an example of how anemia can develop through iron deficiency. You can also have an anemia develop through blood loss, okay? So if you get an injury to your body where you are losing blood, all right, you're decreasing your blood volume, and you're therefore decreasing the amount of red blood cells in your whole blood. And anemia can also develop under a number of other conditions. But for the purposes of this chapter and for the testing, I want you to understand that a low hematocrit is equivalent to a low number of red blood cells, which would be reflected in a condition or a diagnosis called anemia. And when you have anemia, you have a reduced oxygen carrying capacity in your blood, okay? The other end of that you see is the polycythemia. That you don't need to worry about so much, but I just wanted you to kind of see the difference, that the hematocrit can either go below or above normal. You might see somebody have a higher than normal hematocrit in the situation of being transplanted into a higher altitude environment, okay? If you're normally living at sea level and then you travel to Denver, Colorado, you go up into the mountains, a lot of football players and sports athletes will actually go train up in higher altitudes. The reason they do this is because the oxygen in the environment is lower. There is less oxygen present in the air. So their body has to compensate by creating more red blood cells so that they can bind as much oxygen as possible. All right. So a lot of sports players will train in these environments and kind of artificially induce their body to create more red blood cells so that they can, you know, technically work and be active for longer because they have more oxygen supplies to provide for their very, very active muscles. But like I said, for this exam, I really want you to focus on what the anemia is and how that can develop as a reflection of a low percentage of red blood cells or a low hematocrit, okay? So let's say your hematocrit does drop too low, right? You are considered anemic. Your percentage of red blood cells goes below 44. How does your body respond to this? Your body will respond by then stimulating the creation of more red blood cells to bring you back to normal. So let's see how that process is happening. So this is the process of erythrocyte production. Remember, erythrocyte is another word for a red blood cell. Okay. So this process of erythrocyte production is also known as erythropoiesis, the creation of red blood cells. So, erythropoiesis, right? So that is the creation of a red blood cell in the body, okay? So how does your body detect that the hematocrit is low? It detects that the hematocrit is low by sensing how much oxygen is currently being carried within the body, all right? So let's start at the beginning here at number 1, okay? When your heart is pumping blood, it travels to every single cell in your body through a variety of blood vessels or tubes that will deliver that blood with fresh oxygen to just about every cell in your body, okay? However, about 25% of all that blood leaving your heart, also known as cardiac output. So 25% of your cardiac output from your heart, this is freshly oxygenated blood, goes directly to the kidney for filtration, okay? So that blood goes directly to the kidney for filtration, okay? So remember, this is freshly oxygenated blood. Okay, so why is that important? It's important because that's a direct reflection of the blood's oxygen carrying capacity, right? If it's freshly oxygenated and it hasn't lost any oxygen for use by other um, body tissue, then we can get an idea of what the normal is, okay? So let's start at number 1, oxygen availability. Whether this is because there's not enough oxygen in the atmosphere or you don't have enough red blood cells to carry that oxygen, if the oxygen availability goes below your set point or normal, okay? So if this drops or decreases, that lowered oxygen concentration in your blood is going to be detected by the kidneys, because remember, a good percentage of it is going directly to the kidneys. All right, so once that blood travels to your kidneys, this is the step number 2, okay, you have oxygen sensitive cells. These are kind of like monitoring cells, all right? It's constantly monitoring the environment to see what the oxygen concentration is. If the oxygen concentration falls to a point below what's considered normal or below the set point, right, it needs to respond, and it needs to respond by stimulating the body to create more oxygen. Okay, excuse me, to create more red blood cells. Okay, so if the oxygen in the blood is too low, all right, that's going to be picked up by the specialized oxygen sensitive cells in the kidney. And that's going to stimulate the kidney to release a product called erythropoietin. Okay, so if the oxygen in the blood is too low, kidney will respond by releasing a hormone called erythropoietin, okay, which for our sake we are going to abbreviate EPO. Okay, so EPO or erythropoietin is only released by the kidney in response to low oxygen levels. Okay, Again, those low oxygen levels can come from a decreased availability either from the atmosphere, there's not enough oxygen in the atmosphere, or there's not enough red blood cells in the body to carry or bind to the oxygen in order to transport around the body, okay? Now, step number 3, that erythropoietin, or the EPO, is going to leave the kidney. It is going to enter into blood circulation, and it is going to be delivered directly to the bone marrow, okay? So EPO is circulated in the blood until it reaches the bone. And it's the bone that EPO is going to act on. EPO acts on the bone to stimulate production of new red blood cells. Okay. This was also introduced to you, this concept, within your blood case study for your biology lab section, that very first lab, okay? So when the EPO circulates throughout the circulatory system and hits the bone, okay, it is going to act specifically on the bone marrow, okay, the substance that's inside of the bone. Inside of the bone, it is the red bone marrow. Okay. You have yellow and you have red bone marrow. It is the red bone marrow that is responsible for creating new red blood cells. Okay. The red bone marrow will create new red blood cells, and this is only if stimulated by that erythropoietin, or EPO. Okay, so once the EPO acts on the red bone marrow is stimulated to create lots of new and relatively immature red blood cells. As the red blood cells leave the bone marrow, they'll start to mature, all right? And the total number of red blood cells in the body increases, okay? So here, red blood cells, I guess new red blood cells, are released from the bone marrow. Specifically the red bone marrow, and enter into general circulation. Once those red blood cells enter into general circulation, they start that pathway of going to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then back to the heart, and then to the rest of the body to get circulated, okay? So once this hematocrit, or percentage of red blood cells, effectively increases, okay, due to the creation of new red blood cells, you can also think of it as increasing hematocrit. That is a direct result of new red blood cell creation. That is going to then go and increase oxygen availability back to set point, okay? So we've corrected the problem. Think about this like a thermostat, okay? This is maintaining what is known as homeostasis. So when you're feeling warm at home, you want to put the air conditioning on. So you're going to kind of adjust the thermostat until the entire room temperature has gone down to what you're feeling comfortable. But then maybe you start to get a little bit cold. So then you adjust the thermostat to go one way or another. So this constant kind of up and down is you maintaining where you're comfortable, your homeostasis, your norm, okay? So this is the same idea here. If the oxygen level starts to go down too low, all right, that is going to kickstart this entire process, which will then help elevate or bring the oxygen back up to your normal or to your set point, okay? So after the creation of all these extra red blood cells has happened, the oxygen binding capacity in the body is going to go back to normal. All right. Once that happens, EPO production from the kidney is inhibited. All right. It's no longer released. The kidney is now going to receive the blood and think, hey, we have a normal amount of oxygen. We can stop creating this hormone that's going to stimulate more red blood cell production. Okay. So red blood cell production stops and we're back at our normal set point. Now, if it starts to drop again, this whole process will be restarted, and this is totally dependent on what the oxygen sensitive cells in the kidney is responding to. All right. So make sure that you understand this kind of circle of how erythrocyte production or erythropoiesis occurs within the body. Okay. In our next video, we're going to move on in your lecture notes to Roman numeral number 2, and we're going to begin talking about hemostasis, which is the prevention of blood loss from the body.